Hello there, everyone. Quick little intro here. This is part 2 of the Taiping Rebellion in Xiuquan's story. If you'd like to find out how we got here, check out part 1. I'll put a link in the description, but for now, let us pick up where we left off after the Taiping have taken control of Nanjing and went through the terrible Nanjing incident, where 2 of the highest-ranking Taiping leaders and their families were put to the sword. We'll begin by going over the Northern Expedition, which is happening concurrently with the events that unfolded at the end of Part 1. The Northern Expedition's goal was to reach the city of Beijing and then to take the city and get rid of any Manchus they could. So, a force somewhere between 70 and 80,000 troops left the city of Yangzhou on May 8, 1853, so about 3 years before the infamous Tianjin incident. This campaign was conceived of by Yang Qing, but was actually led by 2 other men. Lin Fengzhang, who was actually an imperial guard for the Qin before he joined up with the Taiping in 1852, Lin quickly rose through the ranks to become a commander, and the other leader of the expedition was Li Kaifang, who joined the Taiping in 1851 and also quickly rose through the ranks to become a commander of Taiping forces. Initially, the Taiping forces moved quickly through the Anhui and Henan provinces, and then crossed over the Yellow River sometime in late June, where they found other rebel groups willing to join them. The Taiping, they were using the same strategy as they did before, which was to move quickly and avoid any strongly defended towns, and it was working wonders for them again, as they were quickly gaining more and more territory. But when Lin and Li heard about how there was all this really good military equipment and a bunch of supplies just waiting to be taken inside the city of Qing, they decided to divert their course and head there for what they hoped would be a quick siege. Well, fast forward 2 months and the Taiping are still sitting outside the walls of Qing, and over the course of the 2 months they had lost multiple high-ranking officers as well as hundreds and hundreds of soldiers with nothing to show for it. It was also much later in the year now, so the weather was beginning to become much more of a detrimental factor for the Taiping because most of their troops are from the south and were used to much warmer climates. So as time goes on, the colder and colder weather will become one of the key factors that caused the Taiping to fail the siege. After failing to take Qing, Li and Lin decided it was time they headed into the province of Zili and make for their actual target, the city of Beijing, and the destruction of the Qing dynasty. But for some reason, on the way there, the Taiping army changed its course again and headed towards the city of Tianjin instead. Now, just to not confuse anybody, there's the city of Tianjin and the Tianjin incident that we talked about in part 1. The Tianjin incident is just the title of what basically the massacre that happened back in Nanjing, and then Tianjin is the city. Okay, moving on. But before they were able to capture the city, a Qing army commander by the name of Senge Rinchen, who wasn't a Manchu or Han Chinese, he was actually a Mongol. He was a 26th generation descendant of Hussar, who was the brother of the great Genghis Khan. Actually, he's the brother that Genghis teamed up with to kill their older brother when they were just kids, but let's not get off topic because I could go on and on about the Mongols. Well, Senge, he showed up, and in doing so caused a stalemate. The Taiping couldn't take the city with an army behind them waiting to strike, and Senge didn't really want to force a battle and lose it. He also knew that with the winter setting in full force now, that the Qing army was not prepared to camp outside all winter, so he was content to just wait and let the cold do the work of defeating the Taiping for him. And the cold did just that. Over time, it took more and more of a toll on the Taiping soldiers, who again weren't just not used to cold, harsh winters, but they didn't have any of the proper winter gear that would have helped them keep warm. So, with their men freezing to death around them, Li and Lin had no choice but to lead the army away from Tianjin and to a small, not very well defended village, and took that so they could ride out the winter indoors. Well, for Sengye, this was perfect, because instead of having to encircle an entire army camp spread out along the walls of a city, the entire Taiping force was now located all within a few square kilometers. And why did he want to encircle the entire army? Well, that's because he had a plan to drown them all. Sengye ordered his troops from a safe distance to begin to encircle the little village and the surrounding areas with a wall made up of dirt and stones. And while the troops did that, he ordered 1,000 workers to head to the Grand Canal, which was about 40 miles from their location, and to start digging a canal that led all the way back to where they were now. The Grand Canal was, and still is, a large system of connected canals and rivers that helped make transporting goods and troops and, well, civilization really much easier and faster throughout China, and it dates all the way back to 486 BC, when King Fuchai of Wu traveled north to attack the state of Qi and ordered that a canal be built to make travel and trade easier. Anyways, back on track here. By the time the spring came around, Seng's troops had accomplished the task that had been given to them, and in early March 1855, the order was given to collapse the dikes holding back the water from the newly dug canal. With little to no warning of the incoming flood, the Taiping were caught off guard, and the next thing they knew, their entire camp, the little village they were in, was flooded up to the roofs of the houses. Now, nobody knows exactly how many died, but it's safe to say it was in the tens of thousands, as this would end up being the destruction of the entire Northern Expeditionary Force. Now, some of the Taiping were able to scatter in the aftermath of the flood, but as far as there being a Taiping army in the northern part of China, that was done, and the Taiping would never again threaten Beijing. As for the two commanders of this northern expedition, it didn't end well for them either. Ling Fengzheng was hunted down and captured on March 7, 1855, and then for a while, Li Kaifeng was able to elude his pursuers up until March 31st, but in the end, he too was taken prisoner, and yes, both men were then executed by the Qing forces who captured them. Now, this was a devastating loss for the Taiping, but they weren't completely defeated. While the northern expedition was underway, there was another expedition launched just 11 days after the first one started, except this expedition was to head west. The black line you see there is the route the northern expedition took, up until it was destroyed, and the red line is the western expedition. And as you can see, not as much of a straightforward journey for them. The goal of the western expedition was to follow the Yangtze River until they reached Sichuan, where they would then turn and link up with the northern expedition, completing the pincer movement that would hopefully destroy the Qing and get them out of northern China altogether. So, on May 19th, 1855, the Western Expeditionary Forces left Nanking and headed to recapture the city of Anqing, which they did easily less than a month later, and after they got everybody situated, they split the force into 3 separate armies. The first army was to set out north and conquer the Anhui province. These troops were led by a man named Hu Yiguang. Lai Hanyang was the commander of the second army, and he was to lead his troops south to conquer the Jiangxi province. And finally, the third army was led by Zhang Tianyang, and their job, the third army's job, was to go across the Yangtze and attack and harass any Qing forces and cities that they could find. Hu Yiguang then led his men to the Qing city of Luzhou, and sadly, there isn't much about what actually happened besides that the Taiping had apparently gotten really good with their siege mining technology, and that the Taiping finally managed to beat one of the Qing commanders who had given them a little bit of trouble in the past. Zhang Zongyuan, who was in charge of the defense of Luzhou, he had already actually dealt the Taiping multiple defeats, and he's actually the guy who was leading the Qing forces when they ambushed the Taiping at the Suyi Ford, which led to the death of Feng Yunshan and over 10,000 troops. I spoke about that battle in part 1. But Zhang ran out of luck, and on January 15th, 1856, when the Taiping broke through the city walls, Zhang killed himself. Apparently by drowning himself, which I don't even get. Like, how does one drown themselves? The army under Lai Han-ying spent 4 months besieging the capital city of the Jiangxi province, which was Nanjing. But after quite a few losses and no progress, they fell back from Nanjing and headed to Jiangtan, where this time they were successful in taking the city by force. Though, due to his failure to take Nanjing, Lai was replaced with 2 other men, Wei Jun and Shi Zhenzhang. The Western expedition also managed to capture the Pengzai and Hukou counties, as well as the city of Zhuijiang. But, of course, since the Northern expedition was destroyed, the Western expedition's ultimate goal was foiled as well, since now they had nobody to meet up with in Xiuquan, and they weren't going to be able to take over Western and Northern China with just one army. Now, this army isn't done. In 1856, it will be recalled to Nanking to help relieve the siege of the city, which, before we get to that point in the story, why don't we head back there now and see how Hong is doing after the crazy couple of weeks leading up to the Tianjin incident, where, by the end of that, we are left with just the 2 leaders, Hong Xiuquan and Shi Dakai. So we return to Nanking and to Hong and his imperial palace. And since the deaths of Yang, Wei, and Rengan, there has only been 2 kings in charge. So Hong appoints his 2 older brothers to be kings. Hong Renfa is given the title of Peace King, and Hong Renda is named the Blessings King. Now, Shi Dakai didn't like this at all because it seemed to him that Hong was trying to make the kingdom a family affair, and he knew that ever since the Tianjin incident, Hong was becoming more and more paranoid of people outside of his family. Now, Shi Dakai was quite paranoid and closed off as well, but you can't blame him. Remember, his entire family was killed during the Tianjin massacre, so he was pretty much alone. Hong did avenge his family and tried to make Shi happy by giving him more titles and stuff, but it really seems like Shi Dakai was just depressed and not trusting anyone because how did he know it wasn't Hong who gave the order to kill his family in the first place? It's said that he stayed hidden away inside his home and only received written messages and didn't speak to anyone that wasn't a part of his personal staff. She also just thought Hong's brothers were idiots and had 0 qualifications to be in the positions they were in, and it said many of the Taiping court members felt the same way. Hong's 2 brothers, for their part, didn't like Shi in return, and they began to try and undermine him however they could. And for about a year, the tensions built up until finally Shi Dakai was forced to leave Nanking. Also, there were rumors going around the city that the people actually wanted Shi to rule instead of Hong because they thought his brothers were just that bad. So maybe Shi was thinking if Hong's hearing these rumors, he might get it into his head that I'm gonna, try and usurp his throne, so I gotta get the F out of here or I'll end up like the other guys. So in the late summer of 1857, Shi Dakai gathered his most loyal troops together, and they left the city of Nanking. As Shi was leaving the city, he posted a manifesto all around the town, and this is just a part of it, but last year, amidst the disaster and turbulence, I hurried in anguish back to the capital, confident that my unwavering loyalty would be clearly understood by my holy ruler. However, things were not quite so, and imperial edicts were issued one after another. Dark suspicions abounded on all sides. How can my own brush record them all? Because of this, I am determined to exert my utmost to lead a military campaign and re-emphasize my sincerity. I shall endeavor to reward those who walk with God in order to repay the sovereign's grace and goodness. So it seems whatever problem she had with Hong's brothers, it didn't extend to Hong himself, and he remained loyal to Hong until the end. But we aren't there yet. The departure of Shi Dakai didn't do Hong and his depleting mental state any good. It said that he became even more reclusive than he was before and shut himself inside his palace with like 2,000 women. No, they weren't all banging. Some of the women included in this group were his family members, including his mom and mother-in-law, so that must have really sucked. But really, kind of sounds like it sucked more for the girls, because Hong had a very strict rule set, and if any of the women were to break them, they'd suffer beatings. And Hong would tell them if they didn't smile and look happy while receiving this punishment. And if they didn't want to serve their king, that somebody else would want to. Implying that if you don't like the way I treat you, I'll get rid of you for good if you don't want to serve me. Now, Hong and the Taiping were at a very low point at this time. Even some of the lower class people of China, who, Hong was kind of doing this whole thing for, they were starting to turn against the Taiping, and many of the people who owned land didn't like the idea of land distribution that the Taiping were, kind of all about. And with the deaths of basically all the leadership, there was talk of leaving Nanjing or surrendering to the Qing amongst the lower-ranking troops. But when the Qing made it clear that they were executing any Taiping they got their hands on, surrender or not, it hardened the resolve of the rebels and made them continue fighting for the Taiping. To them, it was like either I die fighting for these guys or surrender and the Qing kill me anyways. I mean, really, if the Qing weren't so hell-bent on killing everyone they captured, many of the Taiping troops would have probably surrendered, and the war would have been over much sooner. But with all the bloodshed done by the Taiping towards the Manchu people, it's not hard to see why the Qing government, which again is run by Manchus, would want to destroy the people, calling them demons. Now, I just want to follow Shi Dakai for a while, for a little bit here, and actually kind of rewind a little bit, because I really like this guy. In my opinion, I think he was the best out of all the Taiping kings, and I think that if he were to have taken over the rebellion at this time, taken Hong's spot, it could have ended, well, maybe not even ended, it could have, at the very least, it would have ended in a very different way, in my opinion. I think that he would have been a much better leader. Shi Dakai was only 16 years old in 1849 when Hong sought him out personally. Shi was already the head of his family and was known for his martial skills and his justice in the handling of local affairs, and he too had taken and failed the imperial examinations that Hong did. It only took him about 3 years to show Hong how good of a commander and administrator he was, so by the age of 19, Shi was put in charge of his own army. Though his first wife did leave him when he joined the Taiping Rebellion, so that kind of sucks for him. As a leader of the Taiping, he was known for his compassion towards the small folk and his down-to-earth look on things. It said that he lived in just a tiny, modest home, well, maybe not tiny, but a modest home, and he didn't have poor people's houses torn down so that he could build this huge, big palace like all the other kings and Taiping leaders did. When Shi took over the city of Anqing, he went about reforming both the military structure and the civil structure within the city. He put forth decrees that encouraged the population of the city to get involved with agriculture and start growing their own food, and he cut back taxes for the people, which in turn helped to boost up the commerce that's going on in the city. And he also made it very clear to the inhabitants of the city that they needed to report any soldiers that were misbehaving so that he could discipline them. And he actually did, which made his men act like decent human beings and allowed the population of the city to have some semblance of safety in their lives. Because remember, at this time in China, it's not a good time for people at all. Like, people are just dying all the time. There's warfare and famine and disease everywhere. So it's not fun. And after his arrival in Nanjing, it only took a few months for the edicts and the ideology of Shi to take effect, and Anqing eventually became one of, if not the most loyal and well-managed cities under Taiping control. Shi was also probably the best military commander that the Taiping had, and at one time, He was called the most cunning and strong of the Taiping leaders by Zheng Guofan, the Qing military commander who was one of, if not the biggest rival of the Taiping, but we'll get to him in the future. Shi was just a good dude, even though he could have had multiple ladies all over him. She was happy with his one wife. Of course, he would have to take the women that were kind of basically forced upon him by Hung and the other leaders into his household, but it said that he wouldn't sleep with them, and he would allow them to come and go as they pleased from his home, while all the other women of the kings, if I may say that, they were all locked up inside of their palaces all the time. Even after the Tianjin incident, where his whole family was murdered and he had gathered a massive army together, instead of attacking Nanking and ruining the Taiping forever, he took his army to relieve the Taiping garrison of Huanan, saving them from destruction. So, after leaving Nanking, this is back to the present now, Shi Dakai went on a 6-year-long campaign against the Qin, fighting all over China. In many provinces to this day, there are legends and myths about Shi and his army rolling through the different towns and villages that they came across. He and his men got so far away from the Taiping at one point, some of his men tried to persuade Shi into breaking free from Hung and starting his own little kingdom, but he refused to turn against Hung. And maybe he should have, because in June of 1862, Shi found himself trapped. See, while he was campaigning through all these different provinces, he and his army, there was a Qing army following them, and they had managed to catch Shi with his pants down a little bit. He had made plans to cross his army over the river Dadu, but after just a small portion had made it across the river, it suddenly flooded. Shi tried several times to get his men across, but the waters, they were just raging too furiously for anybody to make it across, and he ended up losing a good chunk of his men just trying to cross the river. Their food rations, they were basically gone now at this point as well, so he decided that he would go to the Qing and try to negotiate a surrender where he could somehow save his men's lives. So, on June 13th, 1863, Shi Dakai walked into the camp of the army that was following him and surrendered. It said that he spoke to the Qing officials with no fear in his voice, and he was then arrested, imprisoned, and then tortured for information, but as far as anyone can tell, the Qing learned nothing from him. And on the 25th of June, he was sentenced to death by slow slicing, or what you might know as death by 1,000 cuts. Shi's enemies wrote down that through the entire ordeal, Shi didn't flinch or cry out even one time, and if you have any idea what slow slicing looks like, you can Google that if you think you're brave enough, but trust me, it's bad. And if he really didn't make a sound, then the man had the willpower of God. Shi was only 32 years old at the time of his death, and as for the men who followed him, well, surprisingly, the Qing actually let 4,000 of them go. But then they executed 2,000 of them, so, 4 out of 6 got to live. Not bad, I guess. Shi Dakai lived such an influential and inspiring life that his actions as general in the Taiping army inspire a young man by the name of Zhu Dai to create the Red Army, which in its own time will go on to evolve into the People's Liberation Army, which is now the official military apparatus of the CCP, aka the People's Republic of China, the government that rules China today. So, now, let us head back to Nanking and see how Hong and the government are doing. They weren't doing well. His brothers weren't doing any good at all in the positions they were given. Really, they were just using them to live lives of luxury and just have a grand old time, really. The field commanders, they didn't have any directions being given to them by the leadership. So for a while, the field armies had no real direction and continuously were losing ground to the Qing forces that were now starting to encircle the Taiping in Jiangsu, which is the province Nanking is in. Times were getting desperate for the Taiping, and for 3 years, they were really on the back foot. But in 1859, somebody showed up to try and put this rebellion back on track. Hong Rengan. If you remember him from the beginning of this podcast, or video, sorry, you'll remember him being the guy, well, the cousin who was forbidden to journey with Hong and Feng by his dad all the way back in the beginning of this story, before Hong was ever even close to becoming an emperor. Over the years, Rengan had heard so many stories about the Taiping and their divinely inspired leader that in the year 1858, he decided he would try to go and visit his cousin that he grew up with, who now was seen as something like a demigod and was the ruler of a whole-ass kingdom. Now, I'll just do a quick rundown of his journey to Hung, because remember, China is like an active war zone at this time, and it was very dangerous to just go walking across the country, especially if you were trying to get from the Qing-held areas into the Taiping-held area. So, in the year 1859, dressed as a peddler, Rengan made his way out of Hong Kong and headed towards Nanjing. You know, I find it funny how no matter what time period or where you are in the world, if you need to travel across a city or a country, basically if you ever need to get from point A to point B and you don't want to be noticed or bothered by people, all you have to do is dress up like a homeless person. In all times and places, it works because nobody wants to talk to poor people. Like, ew, gross. It took almost a year for Rengan to make it to the capital city of Nanjing, and almost cost him his life when he was taken prisoner by a Qing patrol force, but luckily they didn't know who he was and never really interrogated him, so just a few days later they let him go. It was in April of 1859 that Rengan finally reached Nanjing, and when he did, he was surprised to find that large parts of the city were empty. Many of the civilians they had retreated into the countryside or left the province altogether due to the strain put on them by the Qing armies that were at the moment closing in on Nanjing from all sides, making it almost impossible to get food and supplies into the city. When Rengan was finally brought to meet with his cousin Hong in his imperial palace, the two men seemed to fall right back into their old ways, even though it had been 8 years since the last time they've seen each other. Pretty much immediately, Hong bestowed Rengan with the rank of king and gave him the title of founder of the dynasty and loyal military advisor, the upholder of heaven and the keeper of order in the court, the Shield King, Hong Rengan. Friggin' sick-ass name. Rengan was also put in charge of all civil administrations as well, and one of the first major proclamations that he made was to remind people why the Taiping had become a kingdom in the first place, to rid China of all the Manchu demons that they had been suffering under for 200 years. The Taiping, they had been losing followers and not gaining very many new ones for a while now, because most Chinese people, they could care less about Hong and his Sky Daddy. They just wanted a government that could provide a safe and prosperous land for them to live in, and a government that would be able to protect that land if needed. So, smartly, Rengan got the movement to focus back on making, let's just say, China great again, rather than whatever it is Hong was going on about inside his palace. Again, remember, at this point in time, Hong Xiuquan, he's just basically isolated himself from the real world, and he just hangs out in his palace with something like 2,000 women. Not all of them concubines, again, remember, some of them were his family, but there were many, let's call them ladies of the night, that were there, so Hong wasn't really thinking about things like civil administration or conducting a war. So Rengan comes up with the plan to break the siege of Nanjing. His idea was to draw Qing forces away from the Taiping capital by attacking other cities that the Qing were in control of, in hopes that the news of their cities and strongholds being under siege would force the Qing leadership to draw troops and supplies away from Nanjing to deal with those threats. And then, when that happened, the Taiping would converge all the forces that they had onto the Qing camps and defenses that were surrounding Nanjing. But first, let me tell you about this video sponsor. Just kidding, I'm poor, please, somebody give me money. I will need to introduce the two new other kings, though, so before we get to Rengan's sweet plan, let me introduce Li Xiuquan and Chen Yucheng. Li Xiuquan was given the title of Loyal King. Well, not much is known about his early life since he was born into a family of peasants, but sometime during the early years of the rebellion, he joined up with the Taiping and eventually worked his way up through the ranks for years and must have been quite capable and good at his job because eventually he found himself being given the title of king and being third in the power structure. So, not bad for a kid born into a family of nobodies. Chen Yucheng was also born into a peasant family in the province of Guangxi. During the rebellion, he was given the nickname Four-Eyed Dog due to him having two very large moles under his eyes. Mole, 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 mole. I truly hope somebody gets that reference. Chen, he was only 15 years old when he joined up with the Taiping on their march towards the Yangtze River back in 1851. And he too quickly proved his usefulness and rose through the ranks, but it was really the Nanjing incident that we went over in part 1 of this series that opened up the doors to the higher positions for him and Li in the Taiping command structure. Chen, he will be named the Brave King. These two men, alongside Hong Rengan, became the new leadership of the Taiping and tried to keep this rebellion going. Firstly, though, they needed to break out of the siege of Nanjing, so now I'll bring it back to Rengan and his plan on how to do so. The Taiping didn't have enough men near Nanjing to break through the siege line and hold the gap before the Qing reinforcements from other places along the line came to back up their comrades. So, Rengan came up with a plan to try and get the Qing to divert some of the men they had holding Nanjing to other fronts. He proposed that a small force of a couple thousand men sneak out from Nanjing wearing Qing military uniforms that they had collected after all the friggin' battles that had been fought. This force would take a very wide, sweeping march to get in behind the Qing siege lines and head for the capital city in the Zhejiang province. I hope I said that right, which was the city of Hangzhou. Now, attacking Hangzhou would hopefully force the Qing to reinforce the city with some of the troops that were stationed around Nanjing, and when they recalled enough troops to go and defend the capital, and the siege lines seemed to be weakened enough, the next step in the plan was to recall the two armies that the Taiping had in the field that were operating to the north of Nanjing, as well as having the expeditionary force turn around and come back. Then, all three of these armies were to launch an all-out attack on the Qing forces stationed around Nanjing in hopes that this would break the siege and allow the Taiping inside Nanjing some relief, as well as allow the rebels to, get back on the offensive a little bit. Rengan's idea for the next offensive after breaking the siege was to strike east and towards the sea, because he thought if the Taiping could reach the coast and get to the city of Shanghai, which was controlled by foreigners at this time, that they could then buy steam-powered ships and more supplies, as well as possibly come to terms with some of the Westerners in Shanghai, and possibly make an allegiance with them. In fact, Rengan was hoping that the Westerners in Shanghai would join with him, because without outside aid, the Taiping would still be on the back foot. Because even if successful in their plan, yes, they'd capture many more cities and territory, but that also meant that they would have to garrison those towns and fortresses, which would take away a lot of manpower from any attacking forces that they had. And now that the Taiping had a plan, it is time to put it into action. So on February 10th, 1860, the loyal king Li Xiuquan left Nanjing quietly with 6,000 hand-picked troops, all dressed in Qing uniforms. And they were able to slip by the Qing siege lines during the night And it was a huge surprise to the people living in Hangzhou when all around, outside the city walls, Taiping banners began to go up indicating that they were now under siege. And by March 19th, the Taiping, they had blasted a hole in the walls of the city and completely overrun the barely trained, garrison that was left there. And Hangzhou was now in their hands. It was actually the local residents of the city, of the city that stood their ground mostly and the hardest, and they tried to protect their homes and property, but they were no match for the Taiping soldiers, and by now the Qing leadership, they had taken all their personal troops and bodyguards with them while fleeing the city. It said that as the men of Hangzhou fought a losing battle, the women of the city, as prescribed by apparently some ancient moral codes or something like that, began to kill themselves by hanging themselves, stabbing themselves, eating poison, and in some cases throwing themselves into wells to drown. It's safe to say that for a few hours at least, the city of Hangzhou was the worst place to be in the world at the time. Now, of course, the Qing field marshal that was in charge of the army and defenses at Nanjing, his name was Zhang. Well, he hears of the attack on Hangzhou, and just like Rengan had hoped for, he began to send units to go and relieve the city. It's believed that he moved about a quarter of his total forces away from Nanjing to Hangzhou, which significantly weakened the position of the besieging Qing army. But when this force reached Hangzhou, not only did they find it empty of any civilians or Qing officials, they didn't even find the Taiping there. Li Xiuquan had already accomplished what he had set out to do, so after about 6 days of being in Hangzhou, he told his men to put back on the Qing uniforms they had, and they snuck their way back towards Nanjing to meet up with the other two armies that were also heading back towards the city. And by April, all three armies had come back to the outskirts of Nanjing and combined their forces. Now, with 100,000 men facing the Qing's 60,000, the attack was launched. And very quickly, the Taiping smashed through the weakest point in the siege line and came crashing down on the Qing troops from 3 different sides. The Qing troops stood no chance. It's said that thousands of them were cut down that day, and most, if not all, were left where they fell inside their trenches. And for weeks after the battle, whenever a nearby river flooded its banks, the water would find its way into these trenches and float the corpses up and out of them, leaving them strewn across the Nanjing fields for miles. The Taiping forces ended up chasing the fleeing Qing all the way to the city of Danyang, which was about 45 miles away from Nanjing, and it's there that the Field Marshal Zhang, that I mentioned earlier, dies trying to cross a river while fleeing the city. But this in time will turn out to be a good thing for the Qing. Of course, sucks to be that guy. But his death will open up a position of command to a man named Zheng Guofan, who in time, like I mentioned earlier, will become the bane of the Taiping. After relieving Nanjing of siege, the Taiping went on the offensive, and in quick succession they managed to take the cities of Changzhou on May 26th, Wuxi on May 30th. The major city of Suzhou opened its gates without a fight on June 2nd. Wuzhang was captured on the 13th. Jiaqing, I think, if that's how you pronounce that, on the 15th of June, and that set up the Taiping in prime position to head towards the city of Shanghai, where, remember, they hoped to find alliances with the Western foreigners who were staying in the city, mainly the British. When the Taiping advance force showed up outside of the city walls in late summer, they were thinking that at the very least they were approaching a neutral city. Foreign ambassadors had been making their way to see Rengan for weeks now. And the messages back and forth between Rengan and the Europeans seemed to indicate that an alliance was going to be formed between the Taiping and the Westerners in Shanghai. But as the Taiping forces approached the city, all of a sudden shots rang out, and artillery began to fall in their positions, with one shell falling directly on top of the head of one of the Taiping flag bearers, turning him into a fine red mist and leaving the men around him filled with fragments of his bones. It turns out the Qing had been able to get to the British, French, and American leaders inside the city before the Taiping had arrived, and had offered them large sums of money. In fact, they offered $100 per month per man to defend the city against the rebels. Now, Rengan was quite surprised and of course upset at the British, French, and Americans for siding with the Qing, so he sent letters letting them know of his displeasure. He stated that the Taiping had wanted no quarrel with the Westerners, and that even though blood was drawn on their part, he was willing to let that go and still make an alliance with them. Because Hong, he really wanted some of those steam-powered riverboats that they had, and he needed those for his plan of taking back the Yangtze River. But Li Xiuquan, he knew that that was it for their chances at securing an alliance with a Western power, and then there was no chance in taking Shanghai now that it was defended by Europeans with really good guns and really good artillery. In the whole grand scheme of things, this failure to take Shanghai and secure an alliance with anyone else will become to be seen as kind of the beginning of the end of the Taiping, but definitely a huge blow. With their failure to take Shanghai, and with the Qing forces beginning to regroup under the leadership of Zhang Guofan after their disastrous defeat at Zhujiang, as well as the ever-victorious army becoming more of a professionally trained and equipped fighting force, the Taiping were now again back on the back foot. They had exploded out of Nanjing after relieving the siege, but seemed to have gone too far too fast and were unable to secure a seaport for trade or secure an alliance with Western powers. And now they are again losing ground to Qing forces, and just before I move on, I'll mention the ever-victorious army, which was a big part of the defense of Shanghai. The ever-victorious army was a small army that was actually led by Westerners. The first commander was a man by the name of Frederick Townsend Ward, who was an American mercenary and a sailor, and it's either Frederick himself or his right-hand man, Li Hongzhang, who is given credit for coming up with the idea to arm and train Chinese troops in the Western ways of war. Mr. Ward, he commanded the army up until his death, which came in battle against the Taiping during the year of 1862. The command was then taken up by the British Charles George Gordon, who led the army up until 1864 when it was disbanded. The ever-victorious army is considered one of the major reasons why the Qing were able to end the rebellion in the years to come, but we are not there yet, so let's get back on track. Okay, so as you can see on the map here, the Taiping failed to take Shanghai over here in the east after they broke out of Nanjing over here. Down the Yangtze River to the east again is the city of Anqing, which the Taiping had taken years earlier, in the early years of the rebellion. Well, if you remember a bit earlier when I said the Qing general Zhang Guofan was rebuilding and regathering the Qing army, the one that had been destroyed by the Taiping, well, he had finished that and had marched his new army to Anqing and was currently putting the city under siege. I just want to mention a quick side note here. It's called Zhang, called Hakka women, like the women from Hong Xiuquan's people. It said that he called them big-footed witches when he first saw them, and come on, that's hilarious. Anyways, Hong Rengan and the brave king Chen Yucheng gathered together a force to go and relieve the city of siege, but before they could even get there, they were ambushed and routed by a Qing army at Jixan Pass and forced to retreat. though 8,000 Taiping troops were left behind and surrendered, handing over thousands of weapons and massive amounts of ammo. If they had known what was going to happen next, though, they probably would have fought till the end. Zheng Guokan, who is the brother of Zheng Guofan, was then put in charge of what to do with the 8,000 or so prisoners, and at first he had no idea until one of his subordinates chimed in. He said, "Hey, why don't we just take groups of 10 of them at a time out of the prison camp there and behead them in batches? That way we could be done by midday." Guokan, who couldn't stomach seeing the grisly act be done, left the man in charge, and this officer then personally saw to the executions of 8,000 people that day. And yes, they were done by dark, starting at 7 in the morning, and the final heads fell before the sun went down that evening. Now, Chen and Rengan would continue to try and break the siege of Anqing for months, but in the end, on September 3rd, 1861, Chen called for the retreat from Anqing. With his troops exhausted and starving, and again the colder weather coming in, he knew there was no chance to save the city. 2 days later, the Qing forces entered into what can only be described as a horror show. Over the course of the siege, the inhabitants of the city and the Taiping defenders had consumed all the food, and when that was gone, it said that they then ate all the animals, down to the rats, and when they were all gone, they turned to eating human flesh. Qing soldiers reported finding that the markets were now in the business of selling human meat, 38 cents a pound. Zheng Guokan only found around 16,000 people left in the city, since many of the Taiping had escaped through the tunnels they had dug. And if you remember from earlier, Guokan didn't really like the idea of killing people, so he wrote his brother asking him what should be done with these people, and Zheng Guofan's response was, "When we take the city, the proper thing to do would be to kill a lot of people. We shouldn't let compassion lead us to err in the grand scheme of things." So, the slaughter of Anqing went forth. You know, I'm just going to say it. I don't think Zheng Guofan is a good guy. I don't think I like him. The loss of Anqing was a huge blow to the Taiping, and it opened up the pathway to attack Nanjing, where Xiuquan was. So the Qing forces went on an offensive of their own, taking back many towns and cities and reclaiming full provinces back from the Taiping. It was then that another big blow was delivered to the Taiping when Chen Yucheng, the brave king, was betrayed while trying to flee back to Nanjing. A man by the name of Miao Pei Lin, who had defected over to Chen during the siege of Anqing, was supposed to be holding the city of Suzhou for Chen, but had once again defected back to the Qing and surrendered the city. So when Chen showed up in June of 1862, he was captured and then, of course, executed. Zheng Guokan, after being just a terrible human being and having a bunch of people executed back at Anqing, had continued on his way with his troops all the way up to the hill fortress of Yuhuatai, which was only about half a mile away from the walls of Nanjing itself. The hill was about 300 feet high and very well defended, and from its top you could kind of look down into the city of Nanjing. But after taking the fort, Guokan and his forces, they were pretty much trapped there, and they now had gotten news that Li Shuicheng was finally returning to Nanjing with a force somewhere between 100 and 120,000 men. Li, he was able to ignore Hong Rengan, but when Hong Xiuquan called him to return to relieve the siege of Nanjing this time, he had to comply with the Heavenly King's wishes. There was no saying no to Hong Xiuquan, so he headed back to Nanjing. Now, Guokan only had maybe around 20,000 men with him, and at this time there was a massive cholera epidemic going on pretty much all over China, so he was already losing a bunch of men to that, on top of trying to hold the fort against the Taiping coming out from Nanking that were continuously trying to dislodge him. The whole time Guo Kan is in Yuhuatai, he and his brother Guo Fan are sending letters to each other back and forth until one day the letters stop coming from Guo Kan. He had been hit in the face with a piece of shrapnel and had nearly died, but he was still alive, and somehow, even with their commander out of action, the men at Yuhuatai, they held out for another 45 days, even with Li Zhuicheng's army showing up. It said each time the Taiping tried to launch an attack, they lost thousands of men, while Guo Kan's forces only lost hundreds. Li Zhuicheng, again, was eventually forced to retreat, and by June 13th, Guo Kan and his men were finally able to take full control of the fort on top of the hill. And in doing so, this gave the Qing control of the southern gate of Nanking, which they promptly locked down. Then, on June 30th, the Qing attacked the western and northern gates of Nanking with a naval bombardment that pushed the Taiping back from the walls, allowing the Qing to seize control of areas outside of the walls in this part of Nanking as well. Now, with only the eastern part of the city left in control of the Taiping, Guo Kan then set his sights on the final eastern gate of Nanking, the Shen's Gate. Now, it's been a while since we've talked about him, but now that the Qing are outside the walls of Nanking, let's get back to the main man of the story, Hong Xiuquan. Now, Hong hasn't been really involved with the actual governing or administration of the Taiping pretty much since they took Nanking all the way back in 1853, almost a decade ago. He's mostly just been, again, hanging out in his imperial palace, relaxing with all his concubines, just, having a good old time, enjoying life. That is, of course, up until the Qing forces began to surround the city and cut off any supplies heading into Nanking, which very quickly made the situation dire since there was a very large population of civilians inside the city alongside all the Taiping troops that had come back. The mounting pressure and stress caused Hong to become much more paranoid and volatile with his subjects. He invented a new punishment for anybody caught speaking with people outside of the city walls. If caught, they'd either be smashed between rocks or flayed alive in public. I'm guessing many people would have tried to escape the city at this time, but sadly, Zhang Guofan ordered that even the women and children who escaped were to be captured and killed. He did this in hopes that it would scare the citizens of Nanking into staying in the city, which would in turn starve out the Taiping even faster. It's cruel, but effective. At this point, Li Zhuicheng, he knows, well, everybody knows that things are in a very bad spot for the Taiping, so he goes to Hong and tells him that he should evacuate Nanking. But this only angered Hong, and he told Li that he had no faith and that God would protect them. Hong then gave the order to tell everyone in Nanking not to worry. I know you're starving to death, but God will provide us with manna to survive, and that everybody should just eat that. Now, what Hong meant by manna, it's been up to debate, but some Chinese scholars, they think he meant it was some kind of like sweetened honeydew mixed with some medicinal herbs and something like that. But just, it's not food, so not good. Hong, though, he actually went around his palace and gathered up just random weeds that were growing here and there, and said that he was going to eat those. So I guess he's got it all sorted out. But that might have been a big mistake, because soon after doing so, Hong fell seriously ill in the month of April 1864, and for the remainder of his days lay bedridden, unable to move or really speak. Then, on May 30th, 1864, Hong Xiuquan, the Heavenly King and leader of the Taiping and the Heavenly Kingdom, apparent brother of Jesus and son of God, closed his eyes for the final time and passed away. Some historians, they theorize that it was actually suicide by poison that did him in, but in the end, it doesn't matter. The Taiping had just lost their leader, and their heavenly kingdom was crumbling all around them. Now, I think I may have mentioned him briefly earlier. Hong Tianfu, the oldest child of Hong Xiuquan, now found himself thrust into a position that I don't think anybody would be jealous of. Because even though he was now the heavenly emperor of China and leader of the Taiping didn't really have anything going for them. At this point, there was only 2 gates on the eastern side of the city that they had control of, and even with those, they were so low on food and supplies, people were starving, and cannibalism had become a worry in the city. And really, nobody believed in the Taiping anymore. The people that were still fighting for them, they weren't really fighting for some ideology or in hopes of creating a kingdom of God. And no, these people, they were fighting for their lives. They could care less about Hong and the Taiping's leadership and whatever kind of religion they were trying to get going. They were just trying to survive another day. If the Qing weren't so hell-bent on completely destroying the Taiping, and especially the Hakka amongst them, this rebellion probably could have ended, way before the siege of Nanjing. But since the Taiping had committed so many atrocities against the Manchu on Hong's orders, the Qing were now not going to take any prisoners or have any compassion for the Taiping, and especially not for any of the Hakka clan members. Back outside of the walls of Nanjing, the fighting had been non-stop for months now, with the Qing, forces under Guo Fan and Guo Kan, trying to find a way into the city. At one point, just trying to rush the walls with ladders, but that attack failed miserably, obviously. But by February of 1864, the Qing forces, they had completely encircled the city, and had taken control of the Purple Mountain situated right outside the walls of Nanjing, and everyone knew that the final assault would be coming any day now. Since the walls of Nanjing were like 50 feet wide, and the Qing had no cannons that were strong enough to even really dent them, and their ladder attacks, they kept leading to nothing more than a bunch of dead Qing soldiers, Guo Kan reverted to the classic dig a tunnel and fill it with a bunch of things that go boom strategy. And now the Taiping, they knew that the Qing were trying to sap the walls, but because of the naval bombardments coming from the river and the cannons that were set up on Purple Mountain, the Taiping had a tough time sallying out from the walls to attack and destroy the tunneling crews. It was in July of 1864, so again months and months have gone by since the Qing first showed up and put the city under siege. Well, in July, Li Zhuicheng knew that a massive attack was coming, and he knew where these tunnels were being dug, so he ordered about 1,000 troops to again dress up in Qing uniforms, and during the night, these men were ordered to leave the city and attack the workers and soldiers in the tunnel. But these men were easily found out this time, and all of them killed. And the next day, the Qing set off 40,000 pounds of explosives that they had stashed in 10 various tunnels that all ended at the eastern wall of Nanjing. It said that over 2 kilometers of the wall was shot upwards and then outwards, falling on and killing around 700 people, and when the dust cleared, the Taiping and Qing troops were looking at each other through a 2,000-foot breach in the wall, and the final fight for Nanjing was on. When the explosion that brought down the wall rocked the city, Hong Tianfu watched from his palace as the Qing forces began to stream into the city, and the only thought going through his head was, I gotta get the heck out of here. His wives, they tried to stop the young 14-year-old boy from fleeing, but he broke free from their grasp, and he and his 2 younger brothers fled into the crowd of people that was now panicking and trying to find their way out of the city. Tianfu and his brothers, they were trying to head to Li Zhuicheng's palace, but on their way there, Li found them and told them that he had set fire to not only his palace, but the imperial palace as well. So Li told them to follow him, and he took them to a now abandoned temple on the western side of the city, which was sitting on top of a little hill, and this gave them the ability to see the Qing forces streaming through the streets, plundering the city and raping the women. Li's plan was to hide out there till night fell, and then hopefully, disguised as Qing troops, the royal party could sneak out of the city while the Qing forces were busy ransacking the place. Then the plan actually worked. Li was able to escort the royal family and their followers to a tunnel that had been opened up under the walls in the hours since the initial explosion happened. At this point, the Qing, they controlled all entries and exit points into the city, and they had multiple access points into the city. Some soldiers, they were able to just set up ladders and just go right into the city wherever they pleased, and this did not help with the savagery that was going to take place over the course of the next few days, because the Qing armies, they completely lost all sense of discipline, and really all sense of discipline, and really all sense of humanity during the sacking of Nanking. I'll read a quote from a survivor of the horror that was the fall of Nanking. They killed my 2 older brothers in the courtyard. Then they went searching through the rooms of the house. One of the strong ones captured me and carried me out. My little brother tugged on his clothing, and my mother threw herself down before him, weeping. He shouted angrily, "All the rebel followers will be killed, no pardons. Those are our general's orders." And then he murdered my mother and my little brother. My eldest brother's wife came out, and he killed her too. Then he dragged me away, so I don't know what became of my other elder brother's wife. I was grief-stricken, sobbing and cursing at him, begging him to kill me quickly, but he only laughed at me. "You I love," he said. "You I will not kill." Huang Shuahua was only 16 years old at the time, and after being kidnapped by a Qing soldier, she would go on to travel with him for a bit until one day she wrote her story down on a piece of paper, and while staying at an inn, slipped it to somebody, and then just a few hours later, she would hang herself. So, with Hong Tianfu and his brothers safely out of Nanking, it looks like there might be a chance for Li to spirit the young emperor away and possibly try to rebuild the Heavenly Kingdom, now under Tianfu. Except sadly for Li, the horse that he was riding on, it wasn't quite in shape, and just after a couple kilometers of hard riding, the horse collapsed. And with no room on any of the other horses, Tianfu and his followers, they abandoned Li Zhuicheng to his fate and left him stranded. Now, I don't know why, but for some reason, Li, he decided to head back to Nanking and to the temple that he had hidden earlier. But when he got there, he saw that it was in the process of being looted by Qing soldiers, so he found a nice place to sit down, and unbelievably, he fell asleep. When Li wakes up, he finds himself surrounded by Qing soldiers who grab him and escort him directly to Zhang Khan. Now, surprisingly, he isn't executed right away, but it was just 9 days later, when Zhang Guofan arrived in Nanking, that he was made to write up a confession of his crimes, kind of saying, "Oh, my bad, this is all my fault." Most likely he was obviously under torture while this happened. But when he was done that, he was, yes, executed. And that ends the story of the loyal king, Li Zhuicheng. The depths of the depravity and horror that Nanking was held in lasted for about 3 days. The Qing forces, they went through Nanking, looting, burning, and raping everybody that they didn't kill. If you were lucky, you got used as sort of a porter or kind of like a mule. The Qing would force any of the Taiping civilians that they didn't feel like killing to carry off the goods that they were stealing, and some of them were let go after, but many more were killed as soon as their usefulness ceased. The killing had no age cutoffs either. It said that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of children who had been cut into pieces or ran through with a sword, and the streets were full of their bodies. It's also said that there wasn't a single woman left in the city that was under the age of 40. They'd all been kidnapped or killed, or, of course, raped, then kidnapped, or killed. Zhang Guofan, he sent word back to Beijing and the Han Emperor that he had killed 100,000 Taiping rebels. But in reality, there might have been like 20,000 actual Taiping troops and civilians left in Nanking when the walls were breached. Still, obviously a huge amount of death occurred in the city during the fall of Nanking, and sadly, it won't be the last time, as in World War II, the Japanese will commit some of the worst atrocities of that war in this city and its inhabitants. You know, some places, they seem to just really be cursed. I don't really believe in that stuff, but you look at the history of Nanking and it's like, damn, I don't think I'm ever going to go visit there. With Nanking in ruins behind them, Tiangfu, Hong Xiuquan's son, remember, well, he had no choice but to flee to the city of Huzhou, where Hong Rengan was this whole time. But pretty much right after Tiangfu arrived in Huzhou, he and now Hong Rengan, they were both forced to flee the city with maybe 1,000 followers. Zhang Guokhan had learned of the escape of Tiangfu, and he had immediately sent out the cavalry force to chase them down, and this force had made it to the city and had begun to encircle it as well. But Tiangfu and Hong, they were lucky and managed to slip out of the city before the Qing could lock it down. And for the next 3 months, Hong and Tiangfu were able to elude capture, but their luck ran out when one night, as they and most of their followers were sleeping, a Qing scouting party came across them and jumped them in the night, leading to the loss of most of their remaining followers, and it split Rengan and Tiangfu up. Hong wasn't able to get on a horse, and he fled, so he just got up and ran right through the woods, on foot, but very quickly he was chased down and captured. And of course, Hong Rengan was executed. But he is actually the only one of the Taiping leadership that never apologized for what he did or deserted Hong Xiuquan. Even after Hong's death, he remained loyal to the Heavenly King, and he never recanted. It was on the 23rd of November, 1864, that Hong Rengan, the cousin of Hong Xiuquan, and the Shield King of the Taiping, had his last day. As for Tiangfu and the other 2 kids of Hong, well, the other 2 disappeared during the escape from Nanking from what I got, so they're either dead or were successful in escaping and creating a new life for themselves somewhere. Man, that'd be crazy. Could you imagine growing up the kids of an emperor, but then having to watch everything crumble around you to the point you have to assume a new identity and live like a peasant for the rest of your life? I'm going to have to agree with Theodora on this one and agree that I would much rather go down fighting for my empire rather than just capitulating and hoping for the best. No way in hell am I going to live like a peasant if I've been a king. I'd rather be first in the crappiest little town than even second, even in a place like New York City. Tiangfu, maybe 10 of his friends maybe left, maybe even by himself, he managed to make it to a farm where the teenager cut his hair and presented himself as just some random peasant to the farm's owner. And he stayed on this farm up until the harvest was brought in, and then he was forced to move again, and it was during this time that he was captured by Qing forces. And now, this part is sad because remember, Tiangfu, he's only 15 years old, and really, all that's happened is because of his dad's ideas and plans. He had nothing to do with the rebellion. He just so happened to be born to Hong Xiuquan, and at first that must have been, pretty freaking sweet, but not so much now. Tiangfu tried to tell the Qing officials that this whole rebellion, it was his dad's thing and he had no part in it. All he wanted to do was become a scholar and to study the Confucian classics, and if they'd let him live, he wanted to take the imperial exams, the same exams that broke his father and started this whole story off in the first place. But of course, his requests were denied, and on November 18th, 1864, Tiangfu, the son of Hong Xiuquan and the leader of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, had his life cut short just a week before his 15th birthday. Now, there were some other mopping up operations for the Qing to do against the small roving bands of Taiping, but within a couple of years, any remnants of the Taiping will be gone, and China will be left devastated. It's estimated somewhere between 20 and 30 million people died over the course of Xiuquan's rebellion, and that's not including all the numbers. Some historians, they say if you take everything into account, from the deaths in battle to the deaths caused by famine, which was induced by the war, to the amount of births that never actually happened, which would have happened in a normal, safer times, if you add it all up, you can get as high as 100 million lives lost due to the Taiping Rebellion, which would make it the deadliest civil war in human history. To end this whole thing off, I'll leave you with a quote from John Patrick Davies Jr., who was an American diplomat. I hope you all enjoyed listening, and I also hope you have a good one. Good day, good night, whichever time you're listening to this, and goodbye. Xiuquan, the visionary fanatic, became the magnetic leader of a peasant uprising whose origins were not spiritual longing, but material destitution. The goading of poverty, in turn, was caused by overpopulation and economic dislocation. Had it not been for the great groundswell of popular discontent, Hong would not have gone beyond being an obscure religious crackpot, unnoticed in history.